Although constructors seem simple, they're not. This video is not meant to cover constructors in great detail. There is much more information on constructors online. I'll link to some documentation in the description. What are constructors? They are what we use to initialize classes and structs. They are normally used to set default values or initialize fields and properties. We use them to create or new up instances of classes. In this first example, the dog class doesn't have an explicit constructor, but it still has a default constructor we can use to new up an instance of the class. Constructors have the same name as the class they are constructing. They do not have a return type, which is how you can distinguish it from a method. This dog class has an explicit default constructor, but it is still essentially the same as the previous dog implementation. Here we are actually initializing a property in the constructor. Constructors can take multiple parameters and can be overloaded like methods. Something to note, if you add a constructor, you no longer have the implicit default constructor. You can see the red squiggle under the attempt to use the default dog constructor. This is important usage because sometimes you may want to force the user of the class to pass in specific parameters in order to use the class. Here is an example of using default parameter values. This routes both of the constructor calls in the main program to the one constructor, so that no matter what constructor is used, the breed property is initialized. Sometimes you will see things like this syntax being used, where the parameter name is the same as the property or field being assigned to. This is allowed as long as you use the this keyword. But why do that? When you could, just follow normal naming convention and never have that problem? Lowercase your local variables, capitalize public global variables, and use an underscore to prefix private global variables. When you inherit from a class, the default constructor on the base class is called even if you don't explicitly call it. You can explicitly call a constructor for the inherited class by using base. Any parameters used in the constructor can be used in the base constructor call. Constructors are key for dependency injection. I will cover dependency injection more thoroughly in a different video. The reason I bring this up is because it is suggested not to new up objects that the class depends on in the constructor, rather have them passed in. The reason this is important will become more obvious once you understand dependency injection. Again, not going to go too far into this, but this is an example of manually injecting dependencies. What you achieve by doing this is a loose coupling between the dog class and the interface. The reason for doing this and why will be discussed in a different video. Some things to avoid and keep in mind whenever designing constructors are don't use init methods. They can make unit testing difficult. Avoid newing up objects. Not only does this impede unit testing, but also tightly couples classes. Avoid calling virtual methods. For reasons on why, check out the Microsoft documentation in the description below. Name variables correctly to avoid needing to use the this keyword. To briefly summarize, do not do too much in your constructors. Only use constructors to set and initialize field properties. Private constructors are a thing. They are used to prevent creating instances of a class, which may be necessary if the class only has static methods and fields. Static constructors are also a thing, but again not common, so skipping over them. In Visual Studio you can type CTOR, then tab, and it will autocomplete a constructor for the current class you are in. CTOR is short for constructor.